Daniel Jepson.
Hey, good to see you again, Nathan.
Good to see you. How you doing today?
I'm good. My voice is a little bit lower than normal.
I like it. Sounds good.
Yeah, I'm hoping it helps me sound more profound.
Yeah, it gives you a deeper vibe all around.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's what I'm going for here.
which is good, and we need it today because this is a pretty deep concept we're going to be talking about.
It's as deep as they come, I guess.
Why don't you introduce it for us? What are we talking about today?
We're going to be talking about the concepts of time, eternity, and
Nice. You have a little bit of history with this topic.
a little bit. I wrote my master's thesis, about 140 pages, I guess, on the relationship between God and time. So I'm going to be plagiarizing myself a little bit.
I expect quotes and footnotes.
Well, there'll be quotes, but I'll be quoting people I quoted in here, like Augustine and Anselm.
No. I'm saying you should quote yourself.
Well, yeah, usually you want to quote people who have some sort of authority. Maybe not.
All right, cool. So God's eternity and relationship to time and all of that. Well, let's dive in.
We've been talking in the last few weeks about knowing God. And we talked the first week, if you remember right, about the ways we might know God. In the second week, we talked about the problem of knowing God because he is so transcendent from our universe and so different than what we are. So how can our knowledge be true about him? The last episode, we talked about God and his relationship to the universe. And today we're going to expand upon that by thinking about one part of our universe and God's relationship to it, and that is the concept of time. A few things that are more commonplace to us and a deeper part of our life than the way we experience time. But I think God doesn't experience it the way that we do.
Yeah. Okay. So this is going to be a mind bender episode, I think.
Yeah, maybe.
So let's kind of talk about time. You start us off with the definition, maybe.
Well, like Augustine said, I know what time is, but if you ask me what time is, then I can't tell you. But I think we have a common sense notion that time is kind of like this arrow that's stretched out, both backwards and forwards, and we're at a certain place upon that. I think that's the way most people would conceive of that.
I remember in college, one of my friends came up to me, a guy that I was pretty close with, and he said, I think I have a definition of time. And I said, oh, yeah? He said, yeah, the progression of entropy.
Well, that's one way to do it.
I thought that was a pretty good definition at 18. And I don't know if he got that somewhere, but
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah, I can see that. More especially, I'd like us to focus on the idea of eternity, because I think eternity will help us understand time a little bit better. Now, we talked about Psalm 90, verses 1 through 2, as kind of laying the foundation for some of the things we'll be talking about. Why don't you go ahead and read that if you would?
Yeah, it says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God.
That idea of the everlastingness or the eternity of God has always been a part of the Hebrew or Christian understanding about who God is. The question that has come about, though, when you think more about it, is what exactly does that mean that God is eternal? And in particular, it can mean one of two things, maybe more, but this is the way it's usually thought of. One can be that God is everlasting, in the sense that he has always been here. He exists with time the same way that we do. He experiences it the same way, but he had no beginning in time. So he extends backward all the way and he extends forward all the way. And that's often what people think of God's eternity. The other way to understand eternity is to view God not as existing along the arrow of time and completing it even, but as existing outside of that and even originating that arrow of time, as it were. And so we would call this atemporal eternality. Is a negation word, right? So just like an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God, but like a theist does. Atemporal means that we're saying that God does not experience temporality, the sequentiality that we.
Yeah, that's deep. I'm trying to understand what that could look like, because this gets at kind of the problem of knowing God that we talked about earlier. Like, all that we know is temporality. So what could that look like? Or, I mean, do you have a metaphor or an image of what that could look like, or a way to think about that can help us?
Yeah, basically, if you apply the analogy, how we understand God not being in space. So when we talk about God not being limited by space, but that he is everywhere, his omnipresence, We would say he does not have spatial location, so he's not in Indiana versus Texas. And also, he doesn't have spatial extension, so he doesn't take up a certain amount of space, but he's non-bodied being. In the same way, to say that God is eternal in this way is saying, first of all, that God does not have a temporal location. So he is not in 1950 and he's not in 1980 or anywhere else. And second of all, that he does not have extension within time. In other words, duration. So when we think of other things, for example, World War II lasted about 6 years, 1939, 1945. And we can think of our own life, our childhood, or the years that we were in college. Those things have a duration to them. So when we're saying that God is atemporal, the most basic sense, he is not located anywhere within the time-space continuum, and he has no extension in either time or space.
So he has no beginning and no end.
Exactly. But more than that he is actually outside it.
Yeah, and that's tough because we experience God in time. Like
We-
if anybody has said that they've had any kind of experience with God, like they can put a date and time on it.
Sure.
So trippy.
Yeah, it's difficult because all of our experiences are in time. And therefore, if God's not in time, then one of the other things that's true then is that God does not experience temporal sequentiality, one thing occurring after or before another thing. And along with that, God does not experience temporal causation, one thing existing before another thing and therefore causing it. And that's a little bit more difficult to understand, especially for us who that's the only way we experience things.
So does that mean that like God is experiencing time all at once? Like he's experiencing 1910, 2010, 3010, like all at one time? Or the things in the future he can actually use to affect the things in the past because he's outside of that? And I mean, we aren't. Things have to happen in order, right? Yesterday affects today, which affects tomorrow, but God doesn't necessarily have to be working in that.
I'm going to say no and yes to that question because there's actually two questions there. No, I don't think it would be good to talk about God experiencing all things at the same time because for us, that's just a sensory overload. We can't picture that. And that implies, again, that God is in time, but he experiences all these things simultaneously, as it were. That's probably not the best way to think about it because,
It still kind of assumes God's in time.
yeah, kind of in a way. That's
Yeah.
what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, as I was asking the question, I was like, it's still kind of the same framework of like, okay, God's still experiencing this. You know, he might experience it all in 30 seconds instead of a ton of years, but
Right, exactly. But in the second part, I think you're onto something. And this part we'll come back to because I think it can help us understand a lot of things about the Christian life and about God. Unlike us, I don't think it's true of God that causation only works one way, as it were. For him, we wouldn't really say it works backwards because, again, he is outside of time, but rather causation doesn't have a time element to it.
so from the way we experience it, there's something that we are going to experience in the future, but somehow God is weaving it to impact my present.
Possibly. Or more, there are certain things about you that are just eternally true. So even apart from future or past. And that somehow God is able to interact with that in ways that we experience sequentiality, but he doesn't. We experience them in one way, and we view causation then in one way. But we don't have to assume that that's the way that God experiences or deals with those things. All right, so let's talk about this timeless tradition first, and then we'll kind of go back to explaining why I believe it's true. First of all, the idea that God is timeless in the sense of being outside of time, so not just existing everlastingly of unceasing duration, but actually having an existence that is atemporal. This is going back at least to Augustine. So Augustine's writing the 4th century, and he has a long section on God's timelessness. And he comes to the conclusion that God does not exist on the scale of time, but that he created time when he created the universe. Let me just summarize a quote or two. Quote, "The world and time both have one beginning. The world was made not in time, but simultaneously with time. So, and in this, he ridicules the idea that God waited for a while before creating the world. Another great thinker of the church, Anselm, in the 11th century, wrote this: "Thou wast not then yesterday, nor wilt thou be tomorrow, but yesterday and today and tomorrow thou art. Or rather, neither yesterday, nor today, nor tomorrow thou art, but simply thou art outside all time. For yesterday and today and tomorrow have no existence except in time, but thou, although nothing exists without time, nevertheless does not exist within it." So these guys are writing, again, Augustine, over 1,500 years ago, and he was saying that time began with the universe. Boethius, another great Christian philosopher, and Thomas Aquinas had the same position, and most modern theologians, most Christian philosophers of religion have also endorsed this idea.
It's so interesting that you said Augustine ridiculed the idea that God just waited around for a while before creating, because that's kind of totally how I've envisioned it. I don't know if I'm alone in that, but it's kind of like God just kind of existed, and I don't know what they were doing, but they were hanging out, having a good time, and then they decided to create the world.
Yeah. There's a funny story about that. The anecdote is that an opponent of Christianity was kind of mocking and said, well, what was God doing all that time before he created the universe? And supposedly, according to the anecdote, Augustine's answer was, he was taking time to create hell for people who ask irreverent questions like that.
That's pretty funny. I think of that scene in The Shack, William Paul Young's book, fictional book, where, I don't even remember the main character's name, but he goes out into the shack there and meets the portrayal of the Trinity, and they're all hanging out and friends and everything. And that's the vision I get of them hanging out before.
Yeah. And that anecdote, though, is not true.
Yeah.
Augustine never said that. In fact, what he said was the question is wrongly stated because time began when the universe began. So there was not a period of God waiting before that.
Is that true? Is it possible to know? I see how the question assumes temporality on God, which is why it's a faulty question. Irrelevant and irreverent, I guess, or whatever. But how can we really know? Or is it just in the realm of philosophy?
How can we really know what? That God is timeless?
Yeah.
I think this is one of those where the scripture is not going to give us a definitive analysis of whether God's eternity means his everlastingness within time or his atemporality. That is to go beyond what the scripture wants to teach us about God. But whenever Christian theologians have begun thinking about the implications of creation, like Augustine, they have come to this conclusion. So I think the reason that they have done that partly is because it made sense. It was insightful to them that time would be part of creation rather than creation being within time, as it were. We'll come back to that idea. But it made sense to them from God's total creation of all things. Because if that wasn't the case, then you would have two ultimate things. You would have God and you would have time. And they had such a high view of God and his creation that they said, no, that can't be. If creation is creation out of nothing, if there's only one absolute being or one absolute substance or one absolute ultimate reality, that has to be God alone. There can't be two things, time existing alongside of God. So that was their reasoning. And then they also felt that it worked better with the idea of God knowing all things, because if God is within time, say he is in the same time that we are, but he just existed all the way back, it becomes difficult to know how he can know the future perfectly, like the scriptures claim that he does. What's really interesting is that modern physics now agrees with that entirely.
Agrees with what?
Agrees with the idea that time and the universe are not distinct and that the universe and time began together, or that you cannot have time without the universe.
Oh, okay.
So they're agreeing exactly with Augustine, who wrote, 1,500 years ago. This is Stephen Hawking. He writes, before 1915, space and time were thought of as a fixed arena in which events took place, but which was not affected by what happened in it. This was true even of the special theory of relativity. Bodies moved, forces attracted and repelled, but time and space simply continued unaffected. It was natural to think that time and space went on forever. The situation, however, is quite different in the general theory of relativity. Space and time are now dynamic quantities. When a body moves or a force acts, it affects the curvature of space and time. Space and time not only affect, but also are affected by everything that happens in the universe. Just as one cannot talk about events in the universe without the notions of space and time, so in general relativity, it becomes meaningless to talk about space and time outside the limits of the universe. As one physicist, Paul Davies, puts it, time is not simply there, but is itself part of the physical universe. And then he adds, a God who did not create time created space neither.
Can you boil that down? Help me understand both of those guys are saying.
Sure. One of the truisms of modern physics, because the theories of relativity have been so well accepted and confirmed, is that time itself and space themselves are not these empty containers or this field in which the universe exists, but they are part of the fabric. So time and space are simply ways that this universe interacts with itself. Because of that, it doesn't make any sense to view time as an arrow and that at some point within that arrow, the universe began. Rather, the universe began and then time began.
Sequentially or at the same universe and time began together?
They began together.
Okay, so they're
because time is just one aspect of the universe.
Okay, so they're relative to each other.
Yes.
Time, because space and matter exist, time exists, and
Right.
vice versa.
Yes. So if the universe did not exist, time would not exist.
Okay. Wow. And you said physicists have figured that out, like with math.
Right. It's just the general theory of relativity, which has been proven now for 100 years.
So that's Einstein, right?
Yes.
So you're saying that in the 20th century, Albert Einstein confirmed what St. Augustine argued for, in northern Africa in the 3rd and 4th century.
Yes.
That's kind of incredible, actually.
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
It is. Yeah, Augustine came to the same conclusion. He just didn't have the math. But what he had was the scriptures and then the logical implications of the scriptures.
Wow. That's really cool.
It is. And I don't think people talk about that very much.
Yeah. Okay, so that's super fascinating. How does that relate to proving God is timeless or atemporal?
Well, the only way then, unless you reject modern physics altogether, the only way to argue that time is infinite is to argue that the universe is infinite as well. But that is not a Christian position. Christian position is that the universe is a creation of God. It's finite, it's not ultimate.
I'm just thinking, like, Christian perspective, there is a beginning, but the Big Bang also sounds like a beginning as well.
Yes, the Big Bang is a beginning. And it's for that reason that for the first half of the 20th century, even up until the 1960s, you had atheist physicists who argued against the Big Bang. So especially in the Eastern European countries, which were officially communist, they argue for a steady state theory. They argued that there was no Big Bang because they knew that that implied the idea of creation. And they hated that idea.
Creation, or at least some kind of beginning.
Right. So at least a beginning.
Okay.
And the question that is left unresolved then from a naturalist perspective, if you disregard the idea of a creator, is of course why and what brought that into being.
And how do you get something from nothing?
Right. And they would say you don't get something from nothing because the matter would be eternal. So, but somehow the matter, infinitely dense, a singularity, exploded into the universe that we have now, but the matter itself was already here.
So if the matter was here, then time would have been here.
No, time began with the Big Bang.
Okay. But I thought time and matter, this is so trippy. Time and matter are relative.
No, time and space are relative. Time and space are part of the way the universe is created at the Big Bang.
Okay.
Right. So before that, you would have to posit matter existed unless you believe that something arose out of nothing, which doesn't make rational sense to us and certainly not scientific. So you'd have to posit matter was here, but what we know about that matter is nothing because the laws of physics and even the concepts of time and space itself don't apply to that matter. That's why It's called a singularity because it's so singular. There's nothing past that we can't even think about.
Okay. You said that there are Eastern European physicists who argued for a steady state model because the cosmos having a beginning can somehow point to the existence of a creator.
Right. Now, obviously, many people today who are physicists are not believers, are not Christians, but the steady state advocates knew that the idea of a beginning of the universe smacked of creation, and they wanted to avoid that completely.
Wow. Wow. But then Einstein comes around and points to a math-backed beginning of the universe.
Right. And actually, it was almost 40 or 50 years before all the scientific community came to a consensus and agreed with that, because there were people who did not like the idea. But eventually, when they began measuring background radiation of the universe, the rate of expansion of the universe, the evidence became so conclusive that they had to.
So there's not really much weight given to the solid state model.
No.
Okay.
Steady state, yeah.
Steady state. Wow. Sorry, solid state is a computer science term.
Yeah. The upshot of that is, again, that modern physics and Augustine both agree the universe had a beginning, and that beginning was also the beginning of time. Therefore, for Christians, it seems to me almost inescapable to understand God's eternity as a non-temporal eternity, that he does not exist in time like we do. Time itself is a feature of the created universe, and he is above and beyond that, the author of that. It's kind of like if you were creating a video game or you're creating a computer program, but in this case, a video game. You have some computer programming in college, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So,
that was your major?
Yeah.
All right. So you're creating a video game, and in this video game, things have to work a certain way. So you're going to have the certain physics of that universe, the way things work in this universe. When this happens, and this happens, and you're going to set conditions and parameters, but you yourself are not part of that. You can set conditions and parameters within that video game that don't apply to you at all, because you are the creator. You transcend those things. And in the same way, I believe that is a good analogy that God could create things and parameters and ways this universe works while he himself is not bound by them.
Yeah. And to kind of tie that into the general theory of relativity, like time in that video game isn't going to exist without the rest of the game.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like the characters in that game aren't going to move around in time if the code hasn't been written to actually have a game.
Okay. I kind of see what you mean.
Maybe bad illustration. But
No,
I'm thinking through it.
You're just a lot more proficient at understanding computer creation.
So yeah, I would be outside of the game, and I could pause the game and go grab a sandwich or something because I'm out. I mean, not saying that that's what God does, but I'm just saying, like, I'm outside of it. I don't interact according to the laws of that game.
Right. Or to give another analogy, no analogy is perfect, but this one also kind of helps illustrate the way that creation works and the difference between the creation and the creator. Say that I'm writing a book, and it's a book with a timeline. There's a story I'm telling, right? So maybe it's a story of this family or this person, and it happens over 30 or 40 years. So I write a chapter about this person's childhood, and I get to a certain point, maybe they're age 13. And at that point in time, maybe it's set in a certain time period, so maybe that's 1993 when he's 13 years old. At that point in time, I'm like, okay, I've been writing here for the last 3 hours. I'm going to stop. And I stop, and I go and I make myself some coffee so I can think through some things more. Maybe answer a few phone calls or emails. And then 3 hours later, I come back, and maybe I'm in the middle of describing a scene that goes minute by minute. Now, for me, I'm not bound by the timeline of that story. I've taken a break from that. I'm not in that timeline, as it were. I could begin writing a story as a teenager, right? So I'm writing a story, I'm 15, and I'm writing a story about someone like me, so another teenager who's 15, right? And I forget about the story. This is stupid. I've got other interests. I'm interested in girls and sports and all this. And then 40 years later, when I'm 55, I find that old story in maybe one of my boxes, the storage, the attic. And I pick it up and I start writing that story again. And in that story, that boy that I'm writing about is still 15, even though I've had this long period of, say, 40 or 50 years of gap. So what I'm trying to illustrate with this is that there is a story inherent to what I'm writing. There's a timeline. There's a way time works. There's a sequentiality, but that I am not bound to as the creator. Because of that, I have a unique relationship to all that story and the sequentiality of that. And I could go back. I don't know if this is the way God's creation works, but I can go back and revise things that I wrote earlier because I want to make them fit with what comes in later in a better way. In fact, what I understand, most fiction authors do this.
Hmm.
That may be going beyond a little bit what God does. Hard to say, but I certainly think it's conceivable.
What you're getting at is an interaction between God's eternality and then his sovereignty or power.
Right.
So there's an interconnectedness in some of his characteristics.
Exactly. And I think that's one area where we can really think through this. We tend to view God as knowing all things before they happen, so sometimes we feel then that they're locked in, as it were. But that's not really true. God doesn't know things before they happen because that's, again, a time word, a sequentiality word that he's not part of. He experiences them in a different way. So his foreknowledge, if you want to use that word, doesn't lock things in. It's more he understands things as they happen. To us, it seems like foreknowledge, but not to him. In the same way, I think with prayer, one of the big problems we have with prayer is understanding how our prayers could change something that God has already set in place, as it were, or how our prayers of a human could affect God's causality. Because within this world, two people, how do I want to say this? Within this world, that's what we experience. When someone does something, they're the one doing that. No one else is doing that same thing, except maybe coming along to help them. But we have to really step back and say, but if God is outside our normal way of conceiving of time and causation, then maybe that's not true. Maybe the causation of God and the way he works within us and through us is mysterious to us because we're not in that realm of atemporality, but it's only mysterious because we're not there, not because it's not real. I'm not explaining that very well.
Oh, okay. So you're saying foreknowledge does not necessarily mean that it's locked into place.
Right. And even God's sovereignty does not dissolve human free agency. If we think of God as working in time the same way we do, it is hard to understand how God can bring about future results and future actions while also allowing me real freedom. But if we understand that that's not how causation works, then I think we're left a little bit with a mystery, but not a contradiction.
Okay.
And in the same way, you don't escape the problem of human free will by moving away from belief in God. You make it worse because if you move into atheism or naturalism, you still have that problem, but it's even worse because what happens then is that there really is no room for human free will on a totally consistent naturalistic worldview. And we've talked about that before.
Yeah, it kind of ends up being a little bit more deterministic.
Right, because what happens within this universe is determined by the laws of the universe. The past is what produces the future. Therefore, my present is based upon my past by necessity, by the laws of nature alone. There's no agent outside of, there's no agent who can oppose. I'm kind of running out of words here.
Yeah.
So that's the idea. And you can look at episode 3 or 4. We talk about that a little bit.
So you're saying that there's no, like, our prayers can still change the outcome of a situation, or God can still respond to our prayers within our experience of causality. I could see that being actually an encouragement to pray because it's like, okay, God is outside of it. He sees, he knows what's happening. So I can go to God and God can respond to me.
Right. I think we should never limit, based upon our own understanding of how causation might work, our appeals to God to intervene in certain ways and to help. God is not someone so detached from the universe that he does not respond to the people within the universe. In fact, the opposite is true. Just like his transcendence allows him to be immanent, like light that emanates in every part of this room, but it's not in one place, so his eternity allows him to be at all times equally. He is always with us, and He is with us everywhere. That allows us to have great confidence that when we pray, we're not directing thoughts to the sky. We are directing our thoughts and our appeals to a non bodily person who is here always with us in every place that we are. That's a humbling thought. It's also a comforting thought, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, the upshot of all this is that our conception of God is way too small usually. When we think about God and His eternity and His infinitude and His transcendence over all things, including time, it should give us this desire to know this God as much as we can. It should give us a confidence that this God is worth attaching ourselves to and giving ourselves to. It should give us this assurance that He cares about us because He is right here with us.
Yeah, it's different than the conception of God from the Bruce Almighty movie. Did you ever see that?
I did not see that.
So there's this scene. Do you know the premise of it?
Yes.
So he's given all the power of God. The only thing he can't do is counteract somebody's free will. But at one point he gets a headache because he hears all these voices in his head, and it's prayers. And so he's like, okay, well, I need a way of organizing these. Let them all be letters. And then his house like immediately fills up with all the letters. And he's like, okay, I need to do it on email. And so he gets, all on his computer, and he's just working, typing away at 1,000,000 miles an hour, drinking coffee, with one hand, but typing in another hand. Clears out his inbox, and then immediately fills up again. It's just overwhelming. That's a different model of thinking about how God responds to prayer.
Right.
Of like, okay, it's just making God busy. God has limited time, and well, if I'm praying, but also everybody else, and Nigeria and India and Russia and Ireland are praying at the same time, like, how's He ever going to hear my prayers?
Right.
Which feels very impersonal. I know it's not right, but when you see something like that, like, it can stick with you and get put in your subconscious. But it's very different than, okay, God is present like light and emanating here, and almost wants me to change the format of my prayer to not just ask God for things, but to try to recognize His presence.
Yeah.
That is already, it's already true.
Right.
God is present in this moment, and I can recognize that and experience God right here and now.
Yeah.
And have companionship and be in His presence, or at least tune in to His. If we're always in His presence, then the problem isn't necessarily when we don't sense that's not Him. It's on us, and a good spiritual practice to try to recognize that. Kind of like turn on a radio. Radio waves are always here, but unless you stop and you turn it on, then you can't enjoy the beautiful music that's on the other end.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Thanks.
Bill Maher, who is a comedian but also a militant atheist, one of his supposed documentaries where he interviews Christians, and of course he chooses the most stupid and incoherent ones to showcase. Anyway, he mocks the idea of a God who could hear all the prayers at once and respond to them. That is an immature understanding of who God is. Christian thought has taught for better part of 2,000 years that God is infinite both over space and over time, and He is infinitely immanent within both of those things as well. So God does not have to take time to hear different prayers. He doesn't process them sequentially like we do. He is infinite in that degree in a way we can't understand, possibly. He is infinite in that degree. There is no limit, and to understand Him, like that movie Bruce Almighty, is actually an insult to Him and to Christian understanding.
Yeah, and in that movie, at one point, he gets so overwhelmed that he just says, Control A, to select all, and then yes. And then havoc happens because everyone in his city won the lottery. And, so it is like, okay, how does God think through? How does God take time to process these prayer requests and decide yes or no? That's helpful because it's neat how something like God's eternity, which can feel disconnected and hypothetical at the beginning of the conversation, turns to something really practical that is going to affect how we think about prayer and how we pray.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I imagine a lot more implications. A bunch are coming into mind right now, but that would take us down different paths. But yeah, how we think about God does really matter.
Yeah, I think so. I've seen in my own life a lot of the intellectual problems I've had wash away when I understand and think about the bigger picture of who God is and his infinity and his transcendence over the way things work within this universe. I can't explain them all, but if I embrace the idea that this universe is created by an infinite God who transcends it, then they begin to make sense to me. And at least I can be in the place where I can say, all right, just because I don't understand something doesn't mean it's irrational. It simply means I'm not in the epistemic position to understand it yet.
Yeah.
Just like a person in a two-dimensional world is not going to understand how things work in a three-dimensional world.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
that's what helps me.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. It's been a great discussion on God's eternity and time and theoretical physics and prayer.
And Bruce Almighty.
And Bruce Almighty. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Bye.